The Lord your God has chosen you as his treasured possession, because he loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers. You are a chosen generation to proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
Gideon, commander of the Israelites, went to his men bringing the battle plan the Lord had laid out for them. Gideon divided his army into 3 companies. The plan was to distribute empty water jars to each of his men, in which a torch of burning oil would be placed. The jars would be broken in the middle of the night at his command as they surrounded the enemy in a surprise attack. Gideon's small group of 300 men had been reduced from 32,000 men. It was God's plan. Midianite forces were so strong they appeared as thick as locusts in the valley below, their camels as many as the sand by the sea. When Gideon blew his trumpet, it would be the signal for his men to join him in blowing their trumpets and breaking their jars. Armed with more faith than weapons, Gideon would lead his small band of soldiers to victory for Jehovah. Their battle cry, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." By faith, their weakness was turned to strength, and they became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies.
Shalom, hello again. Now this week we're going to look at the stunning character called Gideon. He is one of the exciting men of the Bible. Last week we looked at Moses, of course, a great leader of the children of Israel in the Exodus and so on, but Gideon was in the land, and we'll look at the career of he and the other judges of Israel, all unsung heroes of Bible times. And now to location in Israel. You know, it was a peculiar situation after the Exodus when a whole nation poured into a land. It just doesn't happen. Even today, the Jewish people have been coming back in stages in accordance with the dry bones vision. Some came early in 1948, fought the war for independence. More immigrants came through the 50s, 60s, and so on up to now. Now Russians, Ethiopians are coming, but anyway, it's a long process. After the Exodus was all at once, 2.5 million people, some say, poured into the land together. And of course there was a need for a political system to govern these people. The Knesset, you know, was invented after the Jews returned to the 5th century BC from Babylon, some 1,000 years later. The Knesset is with us today, and it's right behind me. It's the Congress or the Parliament of Israel, and governs the people today. But back then, the tribes were given land allotments, and it wasn't so easy to govern far-flung tribes in a time like, well, 3,500 years ago, when travel took long and so forth. Finally, each tribe, they realized, had to have a law to live by, and they were ordered to conquer the inhabitants, and they were warned of mixing with them. Just as today, there were inhabitants in the land when they arrived. When today's Jewish people come from different countries, they find the Palestinians here. When the Jews came out of the Exodus, they found the Canaanites here. The Jebusites were here. They had to war with them sometimes. They could do a lot of relations, but they could not begin to worship the local gods. That was the anathema. That was what the Lord simply forbade. You can think of the time of Solomon when he married foreign women. He had 700 wives. He was making political alliances and whatnot. He was a full-time sinner too, let's admit. But when taking these foreign wives, sometimes he took their gods with them. He got off into pagan practices himself, not just an ordinary citizen, but the king of all Israel. So in the time of the judges, God intervened to protect them from the tribes around them. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repenteth the Lord because of their groanings by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. It was really a sad time in Israel in a way, from the death of Joshua all the way to Saul, the first king, because there was this constant relapse to paganism. The time of the judges lasted, give or take 300 years, from Othniel to Samson, and they just kept ignoring God's voice. Judges 6:10 tells us, "Then I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But ye have not obeyed my voice." Now the judges, it should be made clear, were not making decisions on legal matters, as we term judges today, and maybe it should be called the book of deliverers, because they were problem solvers, especially when it came to apostasy. But with each judge, there was still the same pattern. First, you'd have a tribal apostasy. When the judge would die, there would be a punishment through enemies of Israel, the tribes coming in, rather like today. Then there would be penitence, the tribe would be sorry, and then forth peace, sort of that. Those were the steps: apostasy, punishment, penitence, and peace. And it was the same old, as Ecclesiastes 1 says, there's no new thing under the sun. Whatever has been, that shall be again, and so forth. That was that kind of time. Now, in the judges' time, of course, there wasn't a national leader, but tribes would get together. They had to get together to fight stronger enemies. And the judges became military leaders in those times. A judge of one tribe might gather 3 together to face a strong enemy. They also were moral advisors. They were God's messengers often. They were inspired figures. They were not elected, by the way. They're just accepted by the people, either out of desperation or sometimes out of faith. They were men of obvious communication with God, similar to prophets. They predated the prophets, but some were like prophets. Some were actually judges and prophets. After the crisis of a battle, they would continue then as the leaders, sometimes in a religious capacity. But then it has to be said, some were not ideal characters. Jephthah was the son of a harlot. Samson, you could say, had rather weak morals. He didn't always wrestle lions. He also had an eye for Philistine women, which was simply forbidden, basically because they were Philistines and they had other gods. They didn't either succeed one another. There were times where there was no judges. It wasn't a question of electing leaders one after another in succession like American presidents. They just, it's more like state governors, and then there were times that a state would not have a governor for a while. Sometimes they would overlap. A judge would be old and still judging, and another one would come into being, and they were together for a while. So it wasn't an organized system. And the Hebrews were falling into temptation. They really did need some kind of national hero. The judges' success became part of a young nation's folklore in a way, but the Lord had set a system for ruling the tribes. Exodus 18:20-22 says this, "And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s, and let them judge the people at all seasons. And it shall be, that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge." When we come back, we'll look at the individuals who would be the heroes of their time.
I've been listening to Zola for 5 or 6 years, and when my mother called and said, I'm planning a trip to Israel, would you like to go? And I didn't hesitate. I said, absolutely. She says, do you know anywhere or how to get there? I says, absolutely. Let me give Zola a call.
This is the most special place in the world, and this was the place we wanted to be.
We can't imagine that we're here. I mean, it's, we just can't imagine we're here.
And it came to pass that Samson loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and said, Entice him, and see wherein his strength lieth, that we may afflict him. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, Samson's soul was vexed, and he said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak, and be like any other man.
Well, we've moved to a beautiful rose garden, which is also here on what we might call Capitol Hill with the Knesset, and at this angle we can also enjoy some of the skyline of Jerusalem. You know, there are 12 judges mentioned in the scripture, 6 minor and 6 major judges. It's a number that God's used many times. It's one he likes. There were 12 sons of Jacob and 12 tribes, 12 disciples of Christ, 12,000 of each of the 12 tribes of Israel, making up the 144,000 in the tribulation. Some of the judges we know a lot about, others virtually nothing. The important 6, there's Othniel, the first judge. He was a nephew of Caleb, and it was not long after Joshua's death that he became the first judge. It says in Judges 3, 9, and 10, And when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Shushan-Rathim, the king, excuse me with that name, the king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. And his hand prevailed against Shushan-Rishalhaim. Othniel, therefore, was a military hero. So was Ehud, the left-handed warrior from the tribe of Benjamin. Judges 3:15 says, But when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised them up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjaminite, a man left-handed. Why does it mention he's left-handed? Well, that really came into play in his career. He visited King Eglon in Moab, and his security men, the security men of the king, made sure that he didn't have his sword on his left side. That's where they checked, because almost everybody seemed to be right-handed, and they wore their sword over here, and they checked that leg as he came in, let him by, and it was a breach of security because he wore the sword on this side and drew it left-handed and was able to assassinate the king. And so the story goes in the scriptures. Deborah was a prophetess. She was the persuader of Barak. Notice these names that reappear in modern times. Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel's name was Ehud Barak. And as a matter of fact, he was left-handed too, in the sense that he was a left-winger. But Barak was a general, and it says in Judges 4, 3-6, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Laphidoth, she judged Israel at that time, and she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in Mount Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Gideon, a farmer, he had 71 sons. He had multiple wives, of course. Judges 6:12 says this of him, And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. He's depressed, he's defeated. But Gideon lived to be one of the great generals of Israel. He selected out an army, only a few hundred men who he tested them by how they drank water from a certain spring, Gideon's spring, and we do it now on our tours. We demonstrate the people. Some soldiers kneel down, lift the water, not watching the battlefield. Didn't take any of those. Instead, he took the ones who always watched the field and drank this way. And in the end, he had, like the U.S. Marines, a few good men and defeated the Midianites in a great battle. Judges 8:22-23 tells us about, Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son, and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Jephthah, sacrificed his daughter. He was the one who was the son of a harlot. It was a very sad story. Judges 11:1 and 2. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, and he was the son of a harlot, and Gilead begat Jephthah. And Gilead's wife bare him sons, and his wife's sons grew up. And they thrust out Jephthah, and said unto him, Thou shalt not inherit in our father's house, for thou art the son of a strange woman. It followed him all his life, I'm afraid. And he, grateful to, but pagan in his thinking, he said he would sacrifice the next person to walk in thanks for some military victory or something. And his daughter walked in, and he sacrificed her. A blot on the history of Israel. Samson was a lone hero. We know him well. The fatal weakness for Philistine women. Judges 13:24 says, And the woman bare a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And finally in 16:21, he has fought with the Philistines. He's defeated the lions. He is finally captured. It says the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. The Talmud finds a special significance in binding measure for measure, an eye for an eye, and since Samson's eyes were the source of his sin, his lust, his chasing after Delilah and so on, then the Talmud implies that was his just punishment, to be blinded. When you think of it, Samson really was kind of a type of Christ, a shadow of the life of Jesus on earth. He's typified in the book of Judges from chapters 13 to 16. His birth was announced by an angel. His mother was told what he was to become, a judge in that case, and of course Jesus brought salvation to his people. He was named salvation. Jesus was announced as the Savior. That bears some explaining. His name, when we say Jesus, it's a transliteration from Greek. That wasn't his name. His name was Yeshua. If he walked down the street today, you said, hello, Jesus, he wouldn't even turn his head. If you said Yeshua, he would recognize his name. Yeshua means Joshua in English, and Yeshua in Hebrew actually means salvation, Yeshua. And so it says in that verse, she called his name salvation because he'll bring his people salvation. It doesn't make sense that she called his name Jesus because he'll bring his people salvation. But if we kept the Hebrew there, as we did with the names throughout the Old Testament, that would make sense. The King James translators really should have used his ordinary Hebrew name. But in any case, Samson performed miracles and the Lord performed miracles. Samson really was treated badly by his own people, and so was the Lord. Betrayed by his own, so was the Lord. And Samson was imprisoned by his enemy with gates barred and a watchman set. Yet in the early hours of the morning, it says, a great while before daybreak, he burst the bars, broke the gate, and issued forth triumphant. That's Samson. That's also the Lord in the tomb. Samson and Jesus both were mocked, and Samson was the judge of Israel for 20 years, which is a very long period for a judge. And Jesus is our judge forever, a very long period for the Messiah. And so in that sense, Jesus and Samson live very parallel lives. And he's not the only one in the Old Testament who has lived a life suggestive of the Messiah to come. The time came for no more judges with Samuel, who filled the role of priest, prophet, and judge. Samuel is a bridge between the old tribal league and the monarchy that was inevitably coming. The war with the Philistines at the Shiloh Ark capture, the priests were killed. 1 Samuel 4:10-11 says, And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter. For there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen, and the ark of God was taken. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. In other words, there was a tragic war, and the ark was captured, the heart of Israel. The Philistines had simply become too powerful, and Samuel, unfortunately, had corrupt sons of his own, not much help. It came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. So you had corrupt judges in power at the same time as the Philistines become so strong. And of course it was a terrible problem for a nation when the leaders are indecisive. Judges 21, 24, and 25. And the children of Israel departed thence at that time, every man to his tribe and to his family, and they went out from thence, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Each man doing that which was right in his own sight is kind of a description of Israel when it first started in our century. That modern Israel started with a war of independence, was very, very tough on the Jews, but they held off 5 Arab nations and they started a country. And they elected a first president, Chaim Weizmann, but frankly, each one in Israel thought he knew best how to run his affairs, and that's how things start out. And there is the famous conversation with Chaim Weizmann and Harry Truman, where Weizmann says, you're the president. Truman says, you know, it's a tough job being the president of 200 million Americans. And Prime Minister or President Chaim Weizmann says to him, you should try being the president of 1 million presidents. So Israel started off in a way in its present time of elected presidents in the same manner as it started off with the kings back at the time of the judges. God has always managed throughout Israel's long history to raise up the appropriate leaders when needed, and the present day is no exception. You know, in 1896, Theodore Herzl became the leader of the movement called Zionism, and in 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Ken went to Independence Hall to talk to Professor Yoav Galbar about the importance of Zionism in Israel's formative years.
What was the place for the Bible in Zionism?
I think it was a very central, crucial place, because it was the basis for the whole Zionist claim that the Jewish people should have a national home and later a state in the land of Israel and not anywhere else. And all attempts to establish a kind of Jewish national life elsewhere, the territorialist solutions that they used to be called, failed. The only place where it succeeded was in the land of Israel. And people, even before the Zionist movement, the movement of enlightenment, Jewish enlightenment, put the Bible in the center of Jewish culture. Now, at that time, Jewish society was a Talmudic society and really neglected the Bible. It was Zionism which brought the Bible back into the center of Jewish culture and tradition. Even today, if you go to Haredic schools in Jerusalem, they don't study Bible almost at all. They study Genesis and the Exodus, the first 5 books, but not more than that. So Zionism, on the one hand, secularized the Bible, turned it into history. On the other hand, it granted it a very central place in Jewish culture, which it holds until today.
You know, Israel has its modern-day revisionists, like we have in America, you know, the kind of historians that say the founding fathers were not real heroes and we're not Christians and all. And we have people over there saying Theodore Herzl was an atheist, that sort of thing. Well, it's silly. In his own notes, he makes constant reference to God and his care for the chosen people. They're just as silly as our people that denigrate our independence. But in any case, Zionism is a force in this world, and if the leaders of Israel are not precisely godly men, that's to be expected. The dry bones vision of Ezekiel shows Israel coming back out of the graves of Gentile nations, at first as dead corpses, and then little by little, bone to his bone and sinew to sinew and so on, they grow into living men and finally become an exceeding great army, and God blows the Spirit into them. He calls the wind, and then they become a modern and spiritual nation ready to take its place as the head of the nations in the kingdom to come. Well, we are watching that process now. Some people don't buy it, but you just have to deny the evidence of your eyes to not see Israel forming in accordance with prophecy. Seminary presidents may not know it, but any common Bible reader knows that God is fulfilling his promise to bring his chosen people back to their promised land, and we are so fortunate to be living in the century when he's really doing this. So Zionism, which really is the philosophy that says the Jews should go back to the promised land, is a very godly initiative. Whether accomplished by believers or unbelievers, it does bring the Jews back to land. It's been working, and they will become spiritual as time goes on, especially, of course, when the Messiah returns. And Paul says in Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved when the deliverer shall come out of Zion. What can I say? It's a wonderful place, and it's established at a time when for 2,000 years you couldn't say you saw any real fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but at least we are seeing the stage being set for what we call the end times and the unfortunate tribulation period to come down on Israel. Remember, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Our offer this week, the video series Sons of Israel. This 9-part series chronicles the fascinating lives of some of God's key men, from Abraham to the Messiah and the Apostles. An informative and stunningly beautiful history of the people God chose and the special men among them that he used for his purposes. Each month, our free Levitt letter brings you updates on recent events in Israel, with insightful articles to help you understand how these events fit into biblical prophecy. We cover the government, the seminaries, and the Lord in these times. The Levitt letter also contains Hebrew lessons, with Hebraic insight, special offers, and in-depth columns written by some of America's finest journalists. Please call 1-800-WONDERS. That's 1-800-966-3377. Or write to Zola, Box 12268, Dallas, Texas 75225. When you're on the internet, visit Zola's website, www.levitt.com. Zola Levitt Presents depends on tax-deductible donations from viewers like you.